Traveling on the southern trains with a baby was a real hassle because they would not let me take put her formula in the refrigerator on the southern trains, which they did on the northern trains. So I had to make up her formula, which was carnation milk and sugar and water, make up about enough bottles, I hoped, to get to, well, I wish David rewind that because I'm ahead of myself. Rewind it. Well, we were in Dallas until 4 o'clock that afternoon, and then the next day we went to New Orleans, where David was stationed with the 8th Naval at the 8th Naval Base to await further orders, and he didn't know when they were going to get them. And so we had 2 weeks together in New Orleans before he got his orders to report to Miami, where he was to be trained for submarine warfare. So he went to Miami, and I got on the train and went back to Amarillo. Well, when he got to Miami, he said, "It looks like I'm going to be here at least 3 months, so why don't you and Sally come down and we'll at least have 3 months together before I'm shipped overseas." So we got ready to go, and traveling on the southern trains with a baby at that time was a real hassle. I had to make up her formula in Amarillo because they would not let me put it up and get a big enamel can and pack her formula in ice, enough for 2.5 days before it could get to Miami. I also had a folding baby buggy, which I could open up so she could sleep in it and have a place to sleep. I had to have a great big huge box of disposable diapers, which weren't very good back in those days, as well as 2 suitcases. So it was, and carrying a 6-month-old baby. Well, when we started out, Dr. Rasco was going to take us and put us on the train. I was unable to check any of that stuff, so when I got to Dallas, I had to get a porter to move all of it and take care of it until we were able to get the train to go across the southern states to get to Jacksonville. So I had to move all of that stuff. Well, we were on the train overnight, got to Jacksonville early in the morning, and they had a big train wreck. And the trains were not going north or south either out of Jacksonville. And we got in there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and here I was with all this stuff and a 6-month-old baby. Well, back in those days, they had nurseries and the stations to take care of all these mothers who were traveling with babies during the war. So I got a porter who said he would take care of my things until my train left. He thought maybe at noon they were going to make up a special train. Well, I went into the nursery with Sally and put her in a baby bed with 2 other babies. There were 3 babies in that train, and stood there. There was no place for me to sit down. Well, I waited and I waited and I waited. I couldn't even go to the ladies' room. I couldn't go to eat. They didn't get the special train made up. They got the special train made up at 6 o'clock that night, but they called the railroad, and they had not put that railroad on my ticket, so I didn't know I was on it. So I stood there until midnight by that baby, waiting for my train. Well, they made up a special train, and I finally got on that train. Well, I was so tired that time, and they had 1 Pullman, but the Pullman was full, and the porter, the conductor, took care of a cute blonde chick rather than taking care of me with a baby. Well, I sat down across the aisle on the chair car with this man from Jessup, Georgia. And I don't know his name, but bless his heart. He looked at me and he said, "Lady," he said, "you look so tired. Can I hold that baby for a while?" And I said, "Oh, would you mind?" Well, he took the baby and he held her for 6 hours. I just died off. Well, I got up the next morning, and by this time I had run out of formula. I had a can of milk, but no water. And I made formula with that old dirty train water, and why I didn't kill Sally, I'll never know. But it did not seem to affect her. Well, we got to Miami, and David had found a place. He couldn't meet us at the train because he was in training, so I took a taxi out to the Blue Moon Motel. When we got out there, we had 2 rooms. We had a sitting room and we had a bedroom. But we had 2 thin cotton blankets, and we had 2 little iron cots about 4 feet wide. We had these 2 cotton blankets, so David and I slept in that tiny little bed underneath his overcoat with both of the cotton blankets. And fortunately, I had Sally's folding baby buggy, so well, that motel had a cesspool, a septic tank. And that septic tank needed to be drained. But every time it had not been drained, and so every time it rained, it would back up in our shower and run all over the shower floor and all over the floor in the bedroom. So David would have to get up and mop the floor, not a very sanitary floor at that, before we could get up. Well, because we had a couple of portable, what do you call them, our stove were hot pads. We had a couple of those. Well, because we had that and running water in our sink, we didn't have any heat. So we made the acquaintance of several other Navy wives who had to wash their dishes and things in their bathroom sinks, but they had heat. So we'd go up to their rooms and stay until it was warm enough so we could get outside, because don't let anybody tell you that Miami is not cold in the morning in December. It is. Well, David was there for 2.5 months taking his submarine training, sub-chaser training, and then we came back to Amarillo before he was to be sent to the South Pacific. Well, when we got
I wanted to ask you, Grandma, as you told this story to me before, and as I recall, the reason you were in a pit was because there was no housing in the town. Why did you end up at this hotel, I guess is what I'm asking.
No housing in what town?
Miami.
Oh, well, they had a few motel rooms, but the hotels were all taken up. They were rented on a full-time basis with, oh, come in. The reason that we were in this motel was that the government had taken over most of the big hotels in Miami that were used for the winter travelers down there as barracks for Army and different ones that they were training. So it was difficult to find housing for individuals who wanted to come down there. Now, because of Sally, we were not able to get out and run around, and we had no car to go to the beach or anything, and we were a long way from either the beaches at Miami or on Miami Beach. So our main entertainment at night was to put our ears up against the wall and listen to the couple she was the manager of the motel, and a very volatile Polish woman from Milwaukee who had a colorful vocabulary. And she and her husband had almost every night had a big fight. Verbal fight, not a physical fight, but a verbal fight. Well, that was our entertainment, was to put our ears up against these paper-thin walls and listen to this fight that was going on next door. She was not a very pleasant individual. Well, we were there just prior to Christmas, and David got very, very homesick on Christmas Eve, and I kept on trying to tell him that he was lucky that we were together on our wedding anniversary, and also for Christmas, that we at least had Christmas together, and a lot of people didn't. But that didn't help his homesickness very much. I really got kind of irritated with him. Well, we were down there for about 2.5 months, and then David got his orders, and we knew he was to be sent to the South Pacific. So we got back, we tried to get reservations on the train, and the only thing we could get on the train to come back to Amarillo, and it was going to take 2 nights, was an upper berth. And the 3 of us, David and Sally and I, all had to sleep in the upper berth. And Sally wasn't used to sleeping with anybody, and so if we got in next to her, she'd start to kick and scream and cry. But we made it home, and David left Amarillo then to go to the West Coast to be sent to the South Pacific. And he was sent to the South Pacific, where he served on a subchaser. Most of the time he was down there for a year and a day off of Peleliu. And he would go 5 miles in one direction and turn around and go 5 miles back. 5 miles one direction, 5 miles back for a year and a day. It was very, very dull duty. And finally, I was coming to New York, going to New York, and then staying 6 months and coming back and staying with the Rascals 6 months. And it wasn't really that they were very interested in me, but they were interested in that grandbaby. Everybody was crazy about Sally because she was the first grandberry in the Morgan sign, and the Rascals' other grandbaby was a grown woman by this time. Or a grown girl. She was a grown girl. She wasn't little like Sally. Well, those trips back and forth on that train just to get tickets were just terrible. In New York City, you couldn't get a ticket on the train until a month before you were to travel. So I would get up real early and go over to Grand Central Station and sometimes stand in line for 8 or 9 hours before I got up to the ticket office to get a ticket. And I always went 30 days ahead of time, because if I put it a day too late, I wouldn't be able to get a ticket. Well, coming back from Amarillo, going back to New York, was not quite as big a chore, because I made the acquaintance of a man named Mr. Denman, who was a travel ticket office, who stayed behind the ticket desk at the Santa Fe Railroad. And Daddy always wanted me to have a roomette, or a drawing room because of Sally. And my mother would say, "You thought nothing of sending me off on the chair car with 4 kids, and here you don't want your daughter traveling with a grandbaby unless she has a roomette or a drawing room," which were not always available. But Daddy would laugh and he'd say, that's different. She's a grandbaby, not your children. So, but it was still a hard trip, and sometimes we wouldn't get into the diner to eat until 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, because they always fed the troops first in the dining car, which they should have. Every train. I'll never forget the first time we came down from New York and came to Amarillo. By luck, David had 1 day off, and he got in Amarillo to come between assignments for some reason. And he and his family were all waiting at the station, at Santa Fe Station downtown, and our train was stopped 8 blocks away for a troop train to go the other way, and was out there 3 or 4 hours when they could have driven out there and gotten me off that train. But I was on that train until it got back down to the station, while they were standing there waiting for me, wasting that time we could have had together. Now, David was gone for almost 2 years. And when he came back, he cabled me and also wrote ahead of time and said he hoped that I would not object to his coming back on a freighter from Hawaii through the Panama Canal to New Orleans. Because he said, if you recall, I've been on this subchaser for a year and a day off of Peleliu going, and as long as I'm out here, I would like to see the Panama Canal. So of course I wasn't going to turn him down on that privilege of Panama Canal, so he did, and I was to meet him in New Orleans. Well, to get a hotel room in New Orleans was just terrible. So finally, Daddy used his influence with the Texas company, or Texaco, back in those days, to get a hotel room at the Jung Hotel. And I arrived at the Jung Hotel on the day that David was supposed to come in. Well, naturally, they changed the ship route, and he didn't come in New Orleans, he came in Galveston. Well, by the time they had changed the ship route and Galveston, I had used up my 3 days, which was the limit back in those days. I'd used up my 3 days stay in the Jung Hotel. So the first day he got home after being gone over 2 years in the South Pacific in the Navy, we literally walked the streets of New Orleans trying to find a place to stay. And we had to stay because he had to go out to Lake Pontchartrain to be dismissed from the Navy. That's where he had to go. Well, David told the taxi driver, he said, "We have to have a place to stay." And the taxi driver said, "Oh, I know the nicest little second-class hotel in New Orleans." So he took us to this hotel, which looked a little strange to me, at any rate. Well, David talked to the taxi driver, and he said, "I know the nicest little second-class hotel in New Orleans." So we drove up to this place, and I'll never forget the name of it. It was the Audubon Hotel. And we walked in, and I thought it looked a little strange. There was a long corridor with chairs all the way up and down the corridor, and the desk clerk was at the end. Well, we went in, and he said yes, he had a room that we could have for the night. So David signed in, and we went upstairs, and here was a double bed with the dirtiest sheets I ever saw in my life. So David found the porter who was on the floor there and tipped him to get us some clean sheets. Well, we got in and got all settled, and I went in the bathroom, and I came out and I said, "David, I can't use that bathroom. There are condiments all over the floor." Well, he looked a little strange and laughed, but didn't say anything. And years later, when I was telling my children about this escapade when they were grown, Sally said, "Mother, condiments are spices that you use in the kitchen. Those were condoms." Well, I'd never seen anything like that before, and I didn't have any idea what they were. Well, we stayed there that night, and David had to get up early and go out to Lake Pontchartrain to start being processed out of the Navy, released from the Navy, and had to go off and leave me in that hotel. Well, I got up, and when I did, I walked the gauntlet. Those chairs were filled with merchant marine, and what we had stayed in was, in not polite terms, a house of ill repute. And David laughed later on and said, "I'm the only man that I know who ever took his wife to stay in a bawdy house deliberately." But I got out that day, and I walked the streets again until I found another hotel that was not quite so obvious. It was still not a hotel that would have a very good reputation, but at least we had a private room and a private bath, and the bathroom was clean.
So no condiments in this bathroom?
There were no condiments in this bathroom. I found another hotel that wasn't quite so obvious, and at least we had a private room with clean sheets and a clean bathroom. The hotel was not what I'd call a five-star hotel, but nevertheless, we did stay there another night until we were able to get out of New Orleans and come home. Well, during the war, I had had more farming experience with Dr. Rasco. And he had 2 farms, one at Vega and one out at Umberger. And he had lost a tenant out at Umberger, so I would go out with Dr. Rasco, and he had, as he said, lumbago, so I would pull and haul out 100-pound feed sacks to feed the cattle because he couldn't do it. He had lost his tenant out there. Well, that went on all during the war because he could get gasoline to go out and see after those cattle because he was not only a farmer, but he was a doctor. So he had a ration car that allowed him to get gasoline. Well, another thing that happened is that he decided to give us a little spec house that he had built during the war boom that he had built, and it had cost $2,500. And it was a small little house with a small living room and 2 small bedrooms, and a little dining room and a little kitchen. But it was in bad shape, and that's when I first learned how to paint. I bought Ms. Rasco bought me the Chemtone, or maybe I did, I don't know. And I painted the inside of that house. And I also waxed the floors. We had to have the floors sanded, so I waxed those floors, and I got down with paste wax and rubbed the wax on those floors to give it a shine with a brick that was wrapped around a piece of a blanket. So I really learned how to do it. Well, of course I was still in that house when David came home, and toward the end of the war you couldn't get any modern appliances, so I had no washing machine. So I did the everyday washing and Sally's diapers in the kitchen sink on a rub board, and would hang them out on the line to dry. Well, of course I couldn't get the big bed sheets in that, so I washed the bed sheets in the bathtub. Well, that went on for a little over a year before it got to the point where I could buy a washing machine. And Mother sent me $100 for Christmas, and so I was able to go down and add $29 or $30 to that and get an old Easy washing machine. Well, the old Easy washing machines back in those days had a big tub to wash in, and then they had a smaller tub by the side that had a spin dry. But you had to lift the wet clothes out of the big tub to put them over in the spin dry. So by the time I got through the laundry, the floor was a loblolly, just covered with water that had leaked, that had fallen off of those sheets while I transferred them from the big tub to the little tub. Well, I used that old Easy washing machine for several years until David Rasco had gone back to work for the newspaper. And when he came home from the Navy, he said, "Now, I have had a long time to think about what I'm going to do." And he said, "I don't want my family to starve to death on a newspaper man's salary. So I've decided to use my GI Bill to go back to school and become a lawyer. What do you think?" Well, I knew that down deep in his heart, David was a newspaper man, and that was what he was going to be happiest doing. So I said, "You've got to be happy doing what you're doing, making a living. But if you want to be a lawyer, that would thrill Daddy to death," because he always wanted a lawyer in the family, and neither John nor Sam were interested. So he'd be thrilled to death to have you go to law school. Well, David stayed around the house a couple of weeks on his terminal leave, and then he said one day, "I think I'll go down to the paper to see the boys." Well, he went down to the paper to see the boys, and when he came home, his eyes were just as big as saucers almost. He said, "The decision has been made for me." He said, "I'm going to go back to work for the newspaper." He said, "They're going to pay me a salary beyond my wildest dreams." And I said, "Oh, David, what are they going to pay you?" And he said, "They're going to pay me $45 a week." And that was not take-home pay. That was gross pay, and they had to take out insurance and Social Security. So it was around not quite $40 a week that he was going to make. And he was the farm and ranch editor, so he had to travel a lot. They made him the farm and ranch editor, so he traveled a lot. And frequently, he'd be out on the road from 6 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock at night, traveling all over the Panhandle. And sometimes when he got in at 12:30, he'd have to go to the newspaper and write a story for the next day's paper. So it was kind of a hard life. And also, he always wanted to come home for lunch because he said he had stood in line at places in the Navy long enough, so he didn't like to eat out on a regular basis. So I never knew whether he was going to come home for lunch at 1 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So life was not too well organized at our house.
Grandma, if I can interject here, what was the year that he came back from the Navy? Was the war over, or was it?
Oh yes, the war was over. He came back after VJ Day. Of course, he was in the South Pacific fighting against the Japanese. So he came back home, and he got home in November after VJ Day. So that was 1940. Was it 45 or 46?
46, I think.
He came home in 1946.
Now, how old was Sally at this time?
Sally was 2.5 years old.
So he was working.
Or she was 3, I guess, because she was born in March of 1943.
So he was working at the newspaper in late 1946 then, or was it?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we lived in that little house over there, and that's where Prue, we were living in that house where Prue was born. And there really wasn't very much room in that house. And we had 2 small closets, 4 feet square, in that, so we didn't have much place to put in to store clothes or anything. And Ms. Rasco would come over, and she had been such a meticulous housekeeper that she wouldn't let David come in the living room until he was 11 years old, except to pass through. Well, as a result, he was not too neat. And he would come in from some of these treats. I remember one time he came in from a trip, and he stopped in front of the front door, and the bedroom door was only 3 feet away, but for some reason he opened up that suitcase right in front of the front door. And it was a double suitcase. He had his clean clothes on one side and his dirty clothes on the other. And he'd pull out the clean clothes and put them on, but he left that suitcase open right there in front of the front door. You had to step over it. And I thought, I'm going to wait and see how long it takes David to pick up that suitcase and put it up. Well, after 4 days, I picked up the suitcase and moved it. He'd come in the front door and just step over it. And if I said anything to him, he said, "Now listen, I grew up with a cranky woman, and I don't want to hear anything." And he smoked back in those days, and he'd flick his ashes on the floor also, because he would forget he wasn't down at the newspaper where he flicked his ashes on the floor. Well, he was down at that newspaper so much that I told him one time, I said, "David, you have a mistress with whom I can't compete." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "It's that newspaper. You think more of that newspaper than you do of me." Well, he denied that, but I honestly sometimes think he did. But he came in one day, came downstairs. Sally was still a little thing. Ms. Rasco had gone to Michigan to visit Margaret, and we were staying over with Dr. Rasco to cook for him and take care of him. David came running out of the newspaper with this great big speed graphic newspaper and said, "Why don't you ride over to White Deer with me? The tornado has come through and blown a Santa Fe train off the track." And I said, "Well, let's go take Sally back home," because she came and let Dr. Rasco take care of her. Well, we went back, and for the first time, Sally cried that I was getting ready to leave. So I said, well, I can't take care of her, so you better go on. Well, he left, and it's a good thing I didn't go with him because he was gone 3 days. That tornado had gone right down the Santa Fe tracks and had wiped out Glacier, wiped out Glacier, Texas, Higgins, Texas, and it ended up over in Oklahoma at a place called Woodward, where it had done a lot of damage and a lot of people were killed, and it was a real devastating tornado. And David was gone for 3 days. So if I'd been with him, I probably would have had to hitchhike home. Well, Dr. Rasco, by that time, Dr. Rasco and I had become very good friends. And he would come over whenever he wanted to that little house, and we'd go out to the farm. I'd take him out to the farm. And I helped him do everything out on that farm. I helped him feed the cattle, and I helped with the branding. And every 2 years, he moved the cattle from that farm to Vega because to fatten up the steers and the barren cows before he sold them, because grass was more nutritious at Vega, and they'd put on a little weight. Well, he moved them one time, and the girl on the tenant farmer at Vega called him, and she said, Dr. Rasco, you've left a calf over at Umberger because we've got a cow over here just bellowing her head off and full of milk. So he called me, and we went over, and here was this big steer stuck in the Tierra Blanca Creek, covered with mud. Well, there again, his lumbago was bothering him, and he was 85 years old, so he couldn't get that steer out of the mud. So I finally got a rope around the steer's neck and pulling and hauling and so on and so forth, got that big steer stuck out of the mud and got it out and rinsed off that mud as well as we could. And we put that steer in the back seat of Dr. Rasco's Ford V8 and drove 40 miles from Umberger to Vega with that steer in the back seat of the car. And another time when I was out there with him, I was pregnant, this time with Prue. But we always had a long handle shovel and a long handle rake in the trunk of that car because we got stuck frequently. Well, we got high-centered that day leaving, and he had me down on my pregnant stomach underneath that car, trying to pull the sand out from underneath the car to get the wheels down on the ground so we could pull out of there and come home. Well, it was a hopeless task in the first place because as I would pull that sand, it would just fall back in there. But about that time, here came a big centipede crawled out in my face, big centipede about 9 inches long. And I said, I've had it, I'm not going to pull anymore, I'm going up and call a wrecker. So I walked about 2 miles up to the highway, and here was this old pregnant lady hitchhiking into Umberger to call a wrecker to come out there and pull us off that high center. And the reason we called Dr. Rasco boy by that time was that during the war, Ms. Rasco was calling Dr. Rasco Daddy, and Sally started calling him Daddy also. Well, we didn't want her calling him Daddy when her own daddy was down in the South Pacific. So we took Dr. Rasco's nickname that David had always called him Daddy Boy. Well, we started calling him Daddy Boy instead of Daddy, and the Daddy was eventually dropped, and Dr. Rasco at 85, well, he wasn't 85 then, he was just about 80, became Boy, and he was Boy the rest of his life, even to the nurses who worked in his hospital. Everybody called him Boy. And
So was he still working as a doctor in his 80s?
he was still going to the office. Dr. Rasco went until he was 84 years old. He went to the office, and believe it or not, he had some patients who stuck with him. He was a wonderful general practitioner, and he had graduated from Tulane University in the 1890s, and that was kind of unusual for those days because a lot of times doctors in this part of the world would go out and take what they called a preceptorship with a practicing physician, and then they'd hang out a shingle and start practicing medicine. But Dr. Rasko had a medical degree from Tulane University.
Tell me some about his early practice and the document you found, which I think is now in the Plains Historical Society Museum. His billing book.
Oh, well, Dr. Rasko started his practice over in East Texas, where he grew up. He and Ms. Rasko grew up she was from Madisonville, Texas, and Dr. Rasko was born in a place called either North Zulch or South Zulch, I'm not sure which. His father lived in North Zulch. There was a railroad track that came through the town, and Ms. Rasko, his mother, lived in South Zulch. They didn't get along very well. But that's where Dr. Rasko was born. And then he came back and married Ms. Rasko. Oh, I'm not sure what the date was, but the early 1900s. He married Ms. Rasko, and they lived in Madisonville. But they lost 2 children down there. One of them, what they called had summer complaint. But I think what happened on one of them was that Ms. Rasko accidentally poisoned that child because she was making peach preserves, and the baby was playing with the peach seeds. Well, the insides of peach seeds, the kernel of a peach seed is just pure cyanide. And she made the remark that baby died in agony that night, all curled up and crying, and they couldn't do anything with her. And I think with the baby, I don't know whether it was the little boy or the little girl. Anyway, the baby died, and I think she accidentally poisoned it. And when I found out what she'd been doing, but I never told her that that's probably what had happened. But at any rate, back in those days, East Texas, where Dr. Rasko was practicing medicine, was also just full of malaria and yellow fever. And they hadn't found out yet what caused either one of them. Both of them were caused by mosquitoes. But at any rate, Dr. Rasko got disgusted with that and decided to move, and he came to Amarillo. And he started out practicing here in Amarillo, and built the house a little later on over at 1408 Harrison, where David was born. And he was a horse and buggy doctor back in those days. David was born in 1913, but I think they came to Amarillo in 1906. So Dr. Rasko was a horse and buggy doctor. He had his barn in the backyard of that house, and his buggy and horse. And frequently he'd go out to call on people in the country, and people who were his early day patients told me that if somebody was really sick, he would stay out there all night and go and look in their refrigerator. If they had anything to eat, he'd fix himself something to eat and some coffee. And then he'd sit there in a rocking chair with a blanket over him and stay all night to see him, and get up periodically to see how his patient was doing. But a few years ago, a woman called me and she said, "I have something you might like to have." And I said, "What is it?" And she said, "It's Dr. Rasko's ledger." And his great-granddaughter had moved, and she did not realize the significance of this ledger, mainly because the back had been torn off of it. But in the front part of it were all of these records of people that he had taken care of here in Amarillo. And there were a lot of prominent names in there, and one of them was the Early family, and he had commented to me several times that Ms. Early had nearly driven him crazy because she was an older woman when her children, Alan and Ruth, were born, and every time they'd get a sniffle, she'd call him. And there were 3 charges for Ms. Early, usually one for the telephone call, which was $1, one for the phone call, the office call, which was $3, and one for the house call, which was $5. Then he had charges in there of how much he charged to deliver a baby. And the babies most of them were delivered at home. And he had one of a good friend of mine. It said Baby Boy Woodburn. They hadn't even named the little boy yet. $15. Cost $15 to deliver this baby at home.
What year was that?
Oh, this was Charles Woodburn. He was born in 1918. And
What else did you find in that in the ledger?
well, back toward the back, he had kept some farm records about how much he had paid for a bull, or how much he had gotten for his farm crops or something. And there was a lot of difference on prices on what he got. And then he didn't have what he got paid, how he got paid in other ways, but he received, during his practice, he received a lot of chickens, a lot of fresh vegetables, a lot of things like that in lieu of payment for money. And one of them was a man named Red, who had a garage. And Red kept Dr. Rasco's cars running, and he was a terrible driver. He kept his cars running in exchange for Dr. Rasco delivering his children and finally his grandchildren. And the last baby that Dr. Rasco delivered before he died, when he died when he was 85, he got a call in the middle of the night, and by this time he was not driving. And he called a taxi and went out to the hospital to deliver one of Red's babies. Well, this was the middle of the night, and he was an old man by this time. Well, that baby started to come, and it was not only a normal, it was not a normal delivery, it was what they called a breech birth, but it also had the baby's hand beside the baby's seat. And there was no way that baby was going to come normally. And it was going to either have to be pushed back in there or have a cesarean, and it was too late to do a cesarean. And he had a terrible time, and one of the Catholic sisters helped him push that baby back up into the birth canal and get that baby turned. And he came home and told David about it. He didn't tell Ms. Rasco, told her about it. And he said, "That's the last baby. I'm not ever going to try to deliver another one." And he didn't. But there are two funny stories about Dr. Rasco. When one-way streets came in and he had cataract operation, he quit driving. So David would come pick him up early in the morning and take him to work, and he'd ride the bus home at noon for lunch. Well, Ms. Rasco never went to town without somebody to take her. And it was just an ordeal to take her to town, because she would shop, sometimes wouldn't buy anything. But you'd have to stay with her. Well, this day she wanted to go to town because there was a bargain on Florsheim shoes. Well, I called her, and she called me to take her, and I said, "Mammy, I can take you, but I cannot stay today, and I cannot bring you home." "Well, that's all right," she said. "I'll take the bus home," because the bus came down. They lived on Harrison Street, and the bus came from town on Van Buren, on Tyler Street, which was really just a very short block from where they lived, and circled around and came down Van Buren, which was just a short block behind where they lived, so it would be no problem. Well, she got on that bus, and Dr. Rasco happened to be there. And he didn't come in, She got off the bus on Tyler Street and walked home, and he didn't come home. About 45 minutes here, he came shuffling in, and she said, "Daddy, where have you been?" And he said, "Well, Willie, I'll tell you." He said, "Some woman got on that bus, and he said she was so much a lot younger than I was, and she made me get up and give her my seat, and I forgot to get off the bus, and I had to ride all the way around and get off the bus on Van Buren." And she said, "What do you mean, some woman? That was me." And he hadn't looked at her, And so long, he hadn't looked at her so long or listened to her in so long that he didn't recognize her. So we all got a big kick out of that.
So they weren't on the most cordial terms as husband and wife?
Well, she fixed his meals for him, but he got to where she had stayed after him for 55 years, so he got to where he didn't hear anything she said. He just went on and did, but just before he died, well, not before he died, he had a stroke when he was 85 years old. But he was able to get, he stayed upstairs and she slept downstairs. He came down and called her and told her he had something wrong. He wasn't speaking well. So this was 6 o'clock in the morning, and by this time she called David. He got up, went over there, and he said Dr. Rasko was sitting at the table in the kitchen, and she was after him as usual. Now, doctor, you can't do this. She'd come down and call him daddy, and she sometimes call him doctor. Doctor, you can't do this. You have to do that. You can't do so-and-so. And she said, David, that his daddy, with all of his strength left, took both hands and pushed himself up from the table and turned around and looked at her and said, "Shut up, God damn it." And those were the last words that Dr. Rasko spoke that anybody could understand. And David said, "Now isn't that tender that your last final tender words to your wife after 55 years of marital bliss are shut up, God damn it."
It's a pretty incredible story.
So
he, after that, the stroke got worse and he couldn't speak.
well, he could see because he had had his cataracts taken off, but he
couldn't speak.
He couldn't speak so that you could understand him. And we'd try to get people in there to stay with him, and she'd fire them. And sometimes he'd get up while she was asleep, because as she said, she was hooked on sleeping pills. And she'd take those, Dr. Rasko used to say, if Willie hadn't slept 20 days out of the 24, she hadn't slept. And if she hadn't had a bowel movement, she'll take a gallon of castor oil on top of the milk of magnesia. But sometimes he'd get up and get out the front door, and we'd catch him walking up and down the street in his pajamas. At least he had his pajamas on.
So he was a little demented after the stroke too?
I don't know. Who knows? No, I don't know that he was. He just couldn't communicate, and he could eat, and he knew where he was. He knew he was at home.
How long did he live after the stroke?
Almost a year.
Now, you've mentioned some of these things about Grandma Rasko. I've heard the story about the wedding, and I think I've heard the story about Great Grandpa Rasko's last words to her. But tell us a little bit more about her. Where was she from again?
She was from Madisonville, Texas, which is down in East Texas.
Do you know how the two of them met?
I have no idea. They met after he got out of medical school, and she came back.
So they were not exactly a happily married couple.
Well, let's put it this way. As far as I know, he put up with her, and never. He would get during the war. People in Amarillo rented. No, the war during the oil boom. It wasn't during the war, although Ms. Rasko rented their servants' quarters during the war. But during the oil boom, places in Amarillo were impossible to stay. And Dr. Rasko had a client come in one day who said, "Dr. Rasko, a friend of mine and I are just desperate. We cannot find a place to stay." And he said, "Do you know of any place?" And Dr. Rasko said, "Well," he said, "we have an empty bedroom at our house, and you might be able, I'll ask Ms. Rasko if she wants to rent it. If she does, you can have that." Well, this man was a man named J. Taylor, who later became a big wheel behind the scenes in the government. And he's the one that started the biggest cattle auction ring in the world here in Amarillo. And he was also on the board of American Tobacco and a personal friend of Lyndon Johnson, and all very influential behind the scenes in the Democratic Party. But nevertheless, he was a young oil man starting out, and his friend was a man named Lawrence Griffith, and he also became a very good oil man. Well, they stayed there, and he left. He never did quit laughing about the time when Dr. Rasco would get a stomach full of listening to Ms. Rasco, and he'd go down in the basement and cut loose with this salty language that was coming out all over the house through the hot air vents, and he didn't know it. So let's put up, Dr. Rasco put up with her. I don't know how fond he was of her, but actually he grew more fond of me than he did anybody, because by the time when he was practicing medicine, he was gone so much. And by the time I married in the family, I was able to take him to the farm, and he told me all kinds of tales about growing up in East Texas and about how he had been a horse trader, and he had taught school, and how he had worked his way through medical school. And of course, things were cheap back in those days. He graduated from a science school up in Illinois in his pre-med before he went to Tulane. But he would come over. I had cherry trees in my backyard in that funny little house over on East 20th I was telling you about. And he'd get up on a ladder, and he'd pick every cherry on that tree. He wasn't going to waste one of them. And we'd sit out on the back porch and pit cherries and pit cherries and pit cherries. And then he had an old apple tree over in his yard. I had to can all those cherries. He had an old apple tree over in his yard. He'd pick up every apple, even if they weren't any bigger than the size of a marble, and come over there and bring them, and I'd have to can those apples or make applesauce or something. Ms. Rasco had gotten tired of doing it. She wouldn't do it anymore. But when he had his cataract operation, back in those days, they were very careful about letting people move their head, because they were sure that their eyeballs would rupture or something if they moved their head after the cataract operation. Now they do it in 15 minutes, and you come home in 30 minutes after they've operated on you. But at any rate, he was in the hospital, and he wasn't supposed to move. Well, they had both eyes bandages after that cataract operation, and he was hallucinating, and he was picking money out of the air. And he'd reach up and he'd say, "You know, I'm crazy, but because I've had to work like a dog for every dime I ever made, but there's a 20. And he'd reach up and he'd get this, and he'd say, "Tommy, come stand by me with that cigar box." So he'd touch my hand and he'd say, "Put that 20 in that cigar box." And he'd lie there a minute, he'd say, "Oh, there's a 10. He'd reach up and get it, pull it back down, hand it to me, and well, David was out there, and he said, "Papa, don't you want," and his sister was out there too, Margaret. He said, "Papa, don't you want Margaret or me to come stand there and take that money for a while?" He said, "Mary Tom's been standing there a long time taking that money." And he said, "No, I don't want you to come over and get that money." He said, "You and Margaret will spend it, and Tommy will save it for me." So I stood there for the longest time before Dr. Rasco quit hallucinating. I think he finally went to sleep.
So Margaret is the, I met Margaret, didn't I?
I think so.
She was the one, they used Aunt Margaret.
Aunt Margaret.
To me.
Yes.
And to
Your
Sally.
great aunt.
When did she died in the 70s, right? Or was it the early 80s?
In the 80s or maybe the early 90s. She hadn't been dead very long.
Where did she live in Amarillo?
Well, she lived all over. She lived over on Van Buren first, and then they built this beautiful big house out on Hughes Street.
Maybe that was the one on Hughes Street that I went to.
Yeah, big, beautiful house.
Huge yard.
Yeah, yeah. And a huge fence.
Yeah. Was she the miser?
The monitor.
The miser.
No, that was Aunt Wilma from Wichita Falls.
Oh.
She was Daddy's baby sister.
Right.
David, Ms. Rasco had another baby after she got up here who was stillborn.
You mean great grandma Rasco?
Yeah. After, she had Margaret, and Margaret was 11 years older than David because she had another baby in between, and that baby was stillborn.
So Grandpa David had 4 siblings, and only Margaret survived him.
That's right.
The other 2 died in their early years.
Infancy.
Infancy.
Yeah. Or well, yeah. The others were probably a year old or a little over a year, something.
When did great grandma Rasco die?
Oh, she died in 1965 or 66. She was dying when I married into the family. And as I told you before, we were married on Christmas Eve. Well, the wedding and everything had been too much of an ordeal for her, so when we went by to see her Christmas Day, she was in bed weeping and said that it was too bad she couldn't get up and celebrate Christmas with us because that was going to be her last Christmas. We wouldn't see her anymore.
And what year was this?
This was 1941, and she lived 20 more years. She outlived her son by 10 years, but she had a heart condition. And David was scared to death that heart condition was going to kill her. Well, what it was were temper tantrums, and she'd go into tachydermia. Heart was beat fast, fast, fast. And the first time they got David up to tell her goodbye, he was 8 years old. So that hung over his life, all of his life. Mama was going to have a heart attack and die. And Mama didn't have a heart attack and die. And the year I was in, well, before she got, as I said, she was hooked on sleeping pills. And I think she tippled a little bit too. But at any rate, I went to Europe in 1962. And the year I went to Europe, she had another episode, and they put her in the hospital. And the doctor said she could not come home without somebody to stay with her. Well, that was the first time she came home. Margaret got somebody to stay with her. She came home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and this woman had been hired to take care of her. And the woman called me that night at 9 o'clock, and she said, "I'm leaving." And I said, "Why?" She said, "I don't have to put up with this." She said, "Ms. Rice, I came over and the house was cold because it had been closed up for 6 weeks. She'd been in the hospital. And I lit a stove, and she came in, turned the stove off and said there'd be no heat in that house. So she wouldn't let me have any heat. She said, I went upstairs. She said, you sleep upstairs. I went upstairs and started to make the bed. Here came Ms. Rasco, who's supposedly not to climb the stairs, and jerked the cover off the bed and said, you can't use those blankets. So those quilts belong to my husband and my son, both of whom were dead by this time, so you can't use them. And so I thought, well, I'll wait till she goes back downstairs and I'll find something to make the bed with. And I went downstairs and started to make supper. And I got food out of the freezer that Ms. Dodson had left here. Got out enough for both of us. And Ms. Rasco said, if you think I'm feeding you, you've got another thought coming. So that's when the woman called me and she said, I don't have to do this. I can get a job, a good job anyplace else. I'm leaving right now. So Ms. Rasco found somebody she liked, and she didn't stay with her all the time, but she was there enough with her. Well, 2 or 3 years later, when I went in 1962, when I went to Europe, she was dying again. And Margaret wrote me a letter, and she said, well, Mama will be gone by the time you get home, but we're putting her in a nursing home temporarily. And I thought, aha, Mama's dying. She'll be there when I get back. She was. I went out to the nursing home to see her. I hadn't seen her in 11 months. And instead of saying, oh, honey, how are you? I'm so glad to see you. I walked in the door and she said, when are you getting me out of this place? And I said, well, Mammy, I'm not getting you out. This is your daughter's responsibility. And I said, the doctors have said you cannot go home again unless you have somebody to stay with you all the time. And I can't get you out. Well, she was in the nursing home. Oh, I think she lived 3 or 4 years. She was 94 or 95 when she died. And she was having heart attacks all these times. But she died of just plain old age. Heart had nothing to do with it.
So all that concern for nothing.
All that concern for nothing.
Did she die in the rest home?
Yes.
Well, she sounds like a real unpleasant woman.
Well, she was, and she was very unpleasant. She wanted to know all of my most intimate business. And she wanted to know what I would have to lie to her if I paid $6 for a pair of shoes instead of $5, because $6 was too extravagant. I was very careful with my money because I didn't have any money.
Well, we're about out of this tape, so say goodbye.
Well, I'll never forget, after David died, my children would go over there and she would start to, David died when he had just had his 37th birthday very quickly. We'd go over there and she'd start wailing and moaning to my children and say, "Oh, you poor little orphans, you poor little orphans. And if your mother ever mistreats you, you know where you can come." Well, my little orphans got where they wouldn't go see her. And one night I went over there and she said, "You've turned your children against me." And for the first time ever, I talked back to her, because it didn't do any good to talk back to her. I said, "I have not turned my children against you. You have. They don't want to come see